Hi guys, I hope you're doing well. And this is a question from November 2019, paper 23. The question, so you guys can read the paragraph on your own. I'm just going to be directly starting with the question. Question two, part A says define tertiary sector and give an example of an industry that is operating in the tertiary sector. So the tertiary sector is basically the service sector of the economy that is responsible, or under which sector all the firms that are providing services, that includes the provision of services that comes under the tertiary sector, such as education, such as banking, such as healthcare. All of these industries, such as law firms, right? All of these industries are responsible for providing services to the people, right? And that is what the tertiary sector is. And that's it. That's it, what you need to write. Question two, part B says explain two reasons why farm workers may be low paid. Okay, so just a tip. Okay, the first two questions need to be attempted within 5 minutes, right? Not more than that. Attempted within 5 minutes, move on. Okay, these are easy questions. You don't have to spend a lot of time on them. The most questions where you need to waste your time is part C and part D. Explain two reasons why farm workers may be low paid. So what you need to do is you need to just state two reasons, and then you need to explain it like anything in the exam, right? Explain those two reasons. So explain two reasons why farm workers may be low paid. Again, it's very easy. Farm workers may be low paid, maybe because the demand is low. So first reason could be that maybe because the demand is low. So if the demand for workers is low, obviously, why would the demand for workers will be low? Demand for workers may be low, maybe because let's say that the primary sector does not have a lot of importance in the country. Maybe let's say in developed nations, the demand for farmers or workers, are farm workers, are usually low. So obviously, if demand will be low, the price of the workers, which is the wages, right? Wages is the price of the workers, will be low as well. Developed nations have more technology and capital equipment. They're more capital intensive nations. So definitely demand for labor, so demand for farm workers would be low in those countries. As a result, workers' wages will be low as well. Another reason in which another reason could be that maybe the supply of farm workers is very high. So if the supply is high, if they are if there's high supply, it means that it would basically reduce the wages as well. So basically, if we draw the diagram, if we say that this is the demand for labor and this is the supply of labor and this represents the equilibrium wage rate, so maybe a rise, although you don't need to make this diagram in a 4-mark answer, but just letting you know that a rise in supply would basically bring your wage rate down, right? Also remember that supply is basically low for workers who can be easily replaced. Workers who can be basically easily replaced, these are those workers whose demand is highly elastic. So if the demand for workers is highly elastic, they are easily replaceable, right? And in what situations the demand for workers can be elastic, or when can they be easily replaceable? Whenever those workers have, let's say, they have low productivity. Workers who have low productivity, obviously they are easily replaceable. The maybe goods that don't have a lot of value in the market, right, or they are not in high demand, those products that have low demand, for them, obviously people won't end up paying a lot of amount to workers for those goods that have low demand, right? Maybe a lot of times, there are certain professions in which low skills and qualifications are required. So for example, let's say these Uber and Careem drivers, right? So there's a lot of supply of Uber and Careem drivers, and also the fact that their supply is elastic, because in order to become an Uber driver, you just need a driving license, and and you should know how to drive. You don't have to do a 4-year bachelor's degree for that. So low skills are required and low levels of qualification are required. So whenever those jobs in which low skills or low qualifications are required, the demand for those workers is elastic. Remember that. And those workers are easily replaceable, because if one worker goes, there's a lot of pool of labor standing behind who can easily replace him, right? So because these workers can easily be found anywhere, right? So in that case, the wages would be low. Remember, oftentimes these kind of questions come: why are wages low or why are wages high? You talk about demand for workers, you talk about supply of workers, then you talk about the elasticity of workers as well. So if the demand for workers is elastic, the wages will be low. On the other hand, if the demand for the workers is inelastic, it means that the workers are not irreplaceable. If they are not irreplaceable, especially highly qualified jobs, maybe engineers, doctors, accountants, these jobs, I mean, the demand for such workers is inelastic as well. Not only the demand is inelastic for these jobs, but also the supply of the workers is inelastic. Remember the fact that the supply of those workers would be inelastic, that would require very high qualification. So, if in order to become a chartered accountant in Pakistan, you need to complete a 6-year degree and a 3-year training program. And we know that in order to become a qualified chartered accountant, that requires extensive amount of hard work, and not everyone can do that. So that is why we see very few chartered accountants in the market. And because of that, it creates a shortage of chartered accountants as compared to what the demand is. And that is what makes their demand inelastic as well. And also, they are very less in supply, right? So their supply is inelastic as well. I mean, it's not easy to become a chartered accountant. So you can't really become a chartered accountant just like that. You need to put in a lot of effort and hard work behind it, like crazy amount of hard work. So industries or professions that require high qualifications and huge levels of skill, or they require high qualification or high levels of education as well. So for those workers, the supply is inelastic. It's not when you're talking about the supply of worker being inelastic, it means how easily they can enter a profession, right? So if the supply of worker is inelastic, it simply means they cannot enter a profession easily. That's it. So you need to understand that if you say that the supply of worker is inelastic, it means that they cannot enter a profession that easily. On the other hand, if the supply is elastic, it means that they can enter a profession easily. For those jobs in which workers cannot enter a profession easily, obviously the wage rates will be higher as compared to those jobs in which workers can enter a profession easily, like Kareem and Uber drivers. It's easy to become let's say, maybe, I don't know, an Uber driver, or maybe an employee at the general store, right? So for those workers, and that is why for those workers whose supply is elastic as well, those workers are more in supply, and hence they are kind of replaceable as well. And that is why the wages would be low. Understood? And also, it also depends upon the strength or the bargaining power of the trade union. Remember that, the strength or the bargaining power of the trade union. So maybe if the trade union is weak, or has low bargaining power, or has low bargaining strength, or maybe the government has not given trade unions a lot of authority, and if they have reduced the bargaining power of trade unions, or the trade unions are weak, right? Or maybe they are weak because maybe the amount of membership in the trade union is not in a very high quantity. Remember, I told you guys that the higher the membership of trade unions, the more powerful they will be, the more bargaining strength they will have. So unions with low levels of employee membership or union membership have low bargaining power, and as a result of that, the union itself is weak, and as a result, the bargaining power is weak, and then they are not easily able to increase the wages of their members or the employees in the firm, or the wages in the economy in general. Remember that if minimum wages for the workers rises, trade unions have a very huge role to play in it, because they constantly push the government to increase the minimum wages in every year, right? So the more stronger the bargaining strength, the more volume the trade union has in terms of membership, the more they will be able to push government to increase minimum wages. Okay, so these are the reasons. Okay, moving forward, part C says analyze how lower unemployment may cause inflation. So the question is asking you on inflation. It's giving you so the question is saying what causes inflation. So it's talking about inflation, and then it's giving you a circumstance. It's giving you a situation, and it's giving you a situation where it says that, okay, fine, there's lower unemployment in the economy, and how can a lower unemployment cause inflation, right? So for such a question, what you need to do is that, first of all, you need to understand that what the question is asking you about. The question is asking you simply about inflation. So you first need to define what inflation is. So you'll say that inflation is basically a rise in the general price level. That's it, right? Or too much money chasing too few goods. Now, if you're saying that how could lower unemployment, that is, if people are, so lower unemployment means that there's more employment. People are in jobs. People are in work. People are at work, right? So lower unemployment basically means that people are at work, people are in jobs, right? So for instance, that you could say, so first of all, it's an analyzed question. So you just need to tell that how lower unemployment will cause inflation. That is it, right? You don't need to say that when will lower employment not cause inflation. You're not supposed to evaluate in an analyzed question. So, and then you also define what unemployment means. You say that unemployment means that people are willing and able to work, but they are economically They are economically active, but they are without jobs. You would also give the definition of unemployment. And then you'll move on to say that, what lower unemployment may cause inflation, because lower unemployment means that more people have jobs. And if more people have jobs, then more people are in work. And as a result of that, what will happen is that the incomes in the economy would go up since people would be paid. And if incomes go up, basically, so if wages are going up, which means that the purchasing power of the people would go up. And if this goes up, this would increase consumer spending. And if consumer spending goes up, the aggregate demand goes up. If the aggregate demand goes up, and that results into a positive consumer spending rises, it results into a positive demand shock, and that would result into demand pull inflation. And then you will draw the diagram for demand pull inflation, saying that, this is aggregate demand, this is aggregate supply. A rise in aggregate demand would basically put pressure on the existing resources, and firms would respond by producing more output. As a result of this, basically what will happen is that it basically puts pressure on your existing factors of production, and that drives up the factor prices. Remember, I told you guys that drives up the factor prices, and if the factor prices goes up, it feeds through the economy. It feeds through the economy in the form of higher prices. So a lot of students will write in the exam that, if aggregate demand rises, it results into demand for inflation. Oh, wow, the examiner will be, oh my God, look at the student knows his stuff. But the examiner will not say that, because you don't know your stuff. If you're saying that aggregate demand causes demand pull inflation, then you need to explain the mechanism behind it. You will say, okay, fine, yes, aggregate demand rises, that puts pressure on existing factors of production, that drives up the factor prices, right? And that feeds to the economy in the form of higher prices in the economy. Because obviously, firms would then transfer that on the consumers in the form of higher prices. So basically, definitely, what will, as a result, demand for inflation will be causing you to draw this diagram. Also, what you can say in the exam is that maybe so lower unemployment would also result into would also result into cost push inflation as well. How could lower unemployment result into cost push inflation? Lower unemployment could result into cost push inflation, because what is going to happen is, basically, if unemployment is less, so you would say that you have more employment, and more employment accompanied with people are in jobs, right? People are in jobs. So if people are in jobs, it means that we are close to full employment. We are close to full employment. And if you're close to full employment, you could say that there might be shortage of resources, yeah, shortage of workers. And if there's a shortage of workers, it means that firms are competing amongst each other. If there's a shortage of workers, remember that firms are competing amongst each other for finding good workers. And if there's a shortage of workers, then this would increase the prices of the workers. That is, wages would go up. And if wages goes up, basically it increases the cost of production for firms. If cost of production for firms rises, it would basically result into cost push inflation, because then you'll make the diagram, and then you will say that what will happen is that it would result into cost push inflation, since your short-run aggregate supply moves to the left, and then it results into higher prices in the economy. And this is how you basically this is how lower unemployment causes cost push inflation in the economy. So lower unemployment can cause both demand pull inflation as well as cost push inflation. How can it cause demand pull inflation? It can cause demand pull inflation because when people are more employed, their incomes are rising, their demand would rise, and that would cause inflation. On the other hand, remember that if unemployment is low, there is another side to it as well. Lower unemployment may also fuel cost push inflation, because the more people are in jobs, it means that they are close to full employment. And if that happens, basically it would ultimately result in a shortage of workers. And a shortage of workers would mean that the wages of the workers would go up, because everyone would be competing to find good workers, while less will be available. And this would increase cost of production, resulting into basically cost push inflation. So if the cost of production rises, so firms, if the cost is rising, the firms need to maintain their profits. And in order to maintain their profits, the firms would increase prices in the economy, and that would basically then feed through the country and the economy overall, and that would result into cost push inflation. So now we will be moving to part D of the question, which says discuss whether or not a country with high wage rates, okay, a country that has high wage rates, obviously generally countries, maybe generally developed countries have high wage rates, right? Will have, but not necessarily, this is not a narrative that applies for every developed country. Discuss whether or not a country with high wage rates will have high unemployment rate as well. So they're asking you a question where they're saying that the wage rate is high. And if the wage rate is high, does that mean that the country's level of unemployment is high as well? Now, if you've given the definition of unemployment in part C, then you do not need to give the definition of unemployment in part D again. Now, do we have to give the definition of wage rates as well? No. Basically, you need to give the definition of the on which topic the question is asking you the question on. So you need to give the definition of economic terms. So unemployment, yes, it's a macroeconomic objective. You need to explain what that means, but you have already done that in part, so you don't need to repeat it. So first of all, first for this question, you need to start your answer by saying that the wage rates of countries may differ from country to country. Some countries have high wage rates, some have low wage rates. Poor countries or developing countries have a low level of wage rates, depend upon a lot of factors, depends upon a lot of macroeconomic factors, depends upon the level of skills in the economy, etc., right? The more developed the country, the more higher the wage rates. But the question I'm asking you, does that mean that the country also has a high unemployment rate? So you'll say that a link can be established between high wage rates and a high unemployment rate. Yes, there is a direct relation, but there is not always a direct relation. It does not always mean that high wage rates will always result into high unemployment rates. And then you'll move on by saying that let's see in what circumstances high wage rates may also end up having high unemployment rates for that country. So let's first agree to, and let's see how a high wage rate can cause a high unemployment rate as well. So obviously, first things first, we know that if wages will be high in the economy, the cost of production would be higher in the economy. Higher cost of production would result into your short-run aggregate supply shifting to the left, and that would result into cost push inflation in the economy. So yes, that's one point that you will make, and then you'll draw the diagram for cost push inflation as well. And that diagram I just showed you in part C, where you would shift the short-run aggregate supply to the left. So yes, higher wages would result into cost push inflation. Definitely, it may result into cost push inflation. Also, if you know that if the wages are higher and your cost of production is high, it would make your exports uncompetitive as well. Because if the cost is going up, your exports would become uncompetitive, won't it? So try to think and try to link one point with try to establish the connection with other points as well. So you know that for the fact that higher cost of production would make your exports uncompetitive. If your exports will become uncompetitive, your demand for exports will go down and your export revenues would then go down. If your export revenues go down, demand for exports go down, it means that your net exports will go down. And if your net exports will go down, we know that net exports is a component of aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is going to fall. And if aggregate demand will fall, basically it would result into falling real GDP, and that would result into cyclical unemployment. We know that if aggregate demand falls, that results into a recessionary impact or a recession as well. Depends upon whether this fall is short term or long term, or persistent or not persistent, or for a consecutive 6 months or not. But in either case, whether it's a recessionary effect or a recession, it would result into cyclical unemployment. So yes, the statement is correct that higher wages may result into higher employment. Oh, by the way, I forgot to explain you that if cost of production rises and if there is cost push inflation, so cost push inflation will also cause unemployment, because if the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, it would result into cost push inflation, and cost push inflation also results into fall in real GDP. And this sort of unemployment is basically known as structural unemployment. Remember that unemployment that is caused because of cost push inflation is known as structural unemployment, because it temporarily shifts the entire structure of the industry. Some of the industries may also shut down because of they can't bear that cost of production. they can't bear that higher cost, so they may end up shutting down as well. So that would result into structural unemployment. So yes, the statement says that high wage rates causes high unemployment. Yes, the statement is correct. Higher wage rates may end up causing high unemployment, both when cost push inflation will arise, and secondly, if it reduces demand for exports, which it might, and that would result into falling aggregate demand, and falling aggregate demand would result into demand deficit unemployment, that is also known as cyclical unemployment. So these are two important points that you can make. Also, you could also say that, if the wage rates are high, so basically wage rates is basically the wage rate is basically the price of labor, right? It is basically the price of labor. So if the price of labor goes up, which is the wages go up, it makes capital cheaper. If it makes capital cheaper, and in many instances, if you can substitute the labor for capital. So many firms may end up doing that. They may start substituting labor for capital. They may start being more capital intensive, since maybe labor intensive is more expensive. So in that case, what is going to happen is, if your industry will start getting more capital intensive because labor is getting very expensive, so that would also mean that if your industry becomes more capital intensive, this would also cause unemployment, since a lot of industries will now lay off the workers and make the workers redundant. And this sort of unemployment is also known as structural unemployment. So it would result into structural. So this basically, if you see, this question is basically this question is coming from the topic of unemployment. In this question, they are expecting you to link a cause. A higher wage rate is a cause. They're expecting you to link a cause with the different types of unemployment that may possibly arise in the economy. Right? So instead of asking you what structural unemployment or demand deficit unemployment is, this would have been much easier. But the question is twisted, and they're asking you to relate this higher wages with the different types of unemployment that may arise. So we know that if your industry is becoming capital intensive, it would result into unemployment, and that would mean structural unemployment in the economy. Because obviously, if the industries start becoming capital intensive, then maybe some of the labor is thrown out. And also remember that if industries shift to being capital intensive, now industries are becoming capital intensive. And remember that if you're capital intensive, initially you weren't capital intensive, but now you're capital intensive as well. So now you may face competition as well from foreign firms. Remember that you may face competition from foreign firms as well, because initially there was competition, but then you were not capital intensive before, you were labor intensive before. But now, since you're capital intensive now, because labor is very expensive, you may now have to compete as per the standards of foreign competition, because you're now faced with foreign competition, because they are capital intensive as well. So if you are capital intensive, they are capital intensive, then they might be more capital intensive, or maybe in a more better way, they might be benefiting from economies of scale. They may be benefiting from technical economies of scale, managerial economies of scale. So definitely you will be quite left behind, and then that might result into some small firms. It might result into some small firms who have recently shifted to being more capital intensive, being out of business, right? So some of the firms may actually shut down. And this kind of unemployment would also result into structural unemployment, because the industry is shutting down because of a higher cost, or the industry is not able to compete with foreign competition. So if the industry, remember, is not able to compete with foreign competition, if the domestic industry cannot compete with foreign competition, and if it shuts down because of being a loser, then that also results into that sort of unemployment is also known as structural unemployment. So these are the three major causes that you can say that, yes, higher wage rates will have an impact on high unemployment. And yes, there is a direct relation between a higher wage rate and high unemployment rate. Then you will say, however, the fact that this is how you start evaluating. However, the fact that higher wages would result into high unemployment is not, or may not always stand true for the following reasons. And then you will start saying those reasons, such as, now it's up to you. You want to start in the same paragraph, you want to move to another paragraph, that's entirely up to you. The examiner does not needs to, paragraphing is not that of a concern. much of a concern for the examiner. Now let's see that what are the causes that may result into the fact that although your wage rates are going up, but then unemployment, that does not mean that unemployment is going up, right? Or let's see the situations in which you'll say that this means that there are many situations in which high wages is not the cause of high unemployment, right? Obviously, yes. Because obviously, if let's say if I'm being paid higher wages, then I might get motivated. And remember that motivation breeds productivity. And productivity results into falling average cost. Falling average cost means economies of scale. Economies of scale would mean, and remember that if productivity goes up, remember demand for labor goes up. Remember that demand for labor goes up if productivity rises. Remember that. Also remember for the fact that if wages are going up, and so if wages are going up, then cost of production would go up. But if wages are going up and at the same time the productivity of the workers is going up as well, then cost of production will not go up. So what I just said was that a rise in wages results into rise in cost of production, but a rise in wages accompanied by a simultaneous rise in productivity offsets the cost of production. Hence, the cost of production does not goes up in that case. Remember, productivity is a very important term. It is an important factor because higher wages means more motivation means more productivity, and higher productivity reduces your average cost, and it increases demand for labor because now if workers are more productive, remember productivity reduces average cost, it increases profitability. So right, so the productivity of the workers is rising, it would make businesses more profitable, and higher profitability would mean that businesses would want to expand, and expansion would result into more investments because investment is a component of AD, right? Investment is a component of aggregate demand, and I is a variable of AD, and investment means expenditure on capital goods, equipment, and also expansion of businesses. So if I being an entrepreneur, and a lot of our entrepreneurs like me see that if the productivity in the economy of labor is going up because the government has increased the minimum wages maybe, or the overall wages are going up, and that is making the workers more productive, then I will know that higher productivity means more profitability. So I would invest more, and I would actually maybe scale up my business, and scaling up my business would mean that. So I'll give you an example. Let's say my company, which I co-founded, Bright. So let's say that if I say that, there are 100 of students with me, and they all end up getting great results in CIs, and everyone is happy. So I ask a lot of my students, do you want to work for Bright? And a lot of them say yes. Why? Because they're like, oh, you know what? We just ended up with A's and A stars, and we are really happy. Yo, I want to work with you. I want to work with you. So obviously that kind of momentum, and I as a businessman would want to catch on that, because I will pay them, and they will also give returns in return to me, because they will work for my company. They will give benefits to my company. Maybe they will produce economic content for me, right? So again, higher productivity, more investments because business confidence rises. Higher investment means aggregate demand would rise, aggregate demand would go up, and obviously this would mean that unemployment would go down, because we know that whenever aggregate demand goes up, your cyclical unemployment goes down. Why? Because if AD is rising, then demand for labor will go down, because businesses would respond by hiring more workers in response to that rise in aggregate demand, right? Also remember that higher wages would also result into more incomes, and more incomes would result into more consumer spending, right? So the consumer spending in the economy would also go up, and if the consumer spending goes up, it would result into rise in aggregate demand, and rise in aggregate demand would mean more spending. And remember that if spending goes up, so according to this demand and supply diagram, if the AD and AS diagram, if aggregate demand goes up, then what happens? If you see this diagram, basically, what do firms do? Firms basically produce more. How do they produce more? By hiring more resources. So they increase output by hiring more resources. So technically what's happening is that higher wages would mean higher incomes. Higher incomes means more spending, consumer spending that increases aggregate demand. In response to aggregate demand, firms hire more workers. So basically, unemployment is not rising. In fact, unemployment will fall. Cyclical unemployment would go down. Demand deficit unemployment would go down. So the statement or the narrative that the examiner has made that higher wages would result into high unemployment rate does not hold true in every situation, and that is what we're trying to say. Also remember that also remember the fact that if the wages are rising, higher wages means higher incomes, right? Higher incomes mean Higher incomes means more income tax. Higher income tax would result into more tax revenues for the government, and if the tax revenues for the government would rise, the government spending would rise, and maybe the government might spend more money on the economy and on trying to reduce unemployment in the economy through maybe training programs, through investing in education, through investing in healthcare. And we know that education and healthcare results into higher productivity. And higher productivity would mean more demand for labor will automatically rise in the long run and future. So, you need to create a bloody chain of analysis. Chain of analysis mean, okay, fine, there is this point. How is this point connected with this point? How is this connected with this? How is this connected with this? How is this connected with this? So you need to make proper connections. Like it should be a smooth movement like this. So you form a Z. What I'm trying to say is that, if your wages are rising, if your incomes are rising, your income tax will rise. Income tax means more tax revenue. More tax revenue means more government spending. If the government is spending on unemployment benefits or welfare payments or transfer payments, now that won't obviously reduce unemployment. But it depends upon where the government is spending that money. If the government is spending money on reducing unemployment through training programs, education, and healthcare, or maybe through infrastructure, even if the government spends money on building infrastructure, that also creates demand for labor, and then unemployment goes down. But it depends upon where the government is spending that money. If the government is using that tax revenue to repay back the debts, obviously then there's no point. That wouldn't cause unemployment to fall. So if the kid writes that, higher income taxes would mean that the government would spend more money and that would reduce unemployment without creating. So you're saying higher government spending would mean unemployment would go down, but you haven't really connected these two together. You haven't put two and two together, basically. Also remember that a lot of developed nations give benefits to workers, like, state benefits, like, not exactly to workers, my bad. I'm saying that they give state benefits like transfer payments or welfare payments, basically to the unemployed people, right? Unemployed people, like they give maybe unemployed benefits or medical allowances, healthcare allowances, education allowances. So to these poor people who can't afford health and education and they can't take care of themselves, right? Or maybe they can't afford basic food. So the government gives money to them on a weekly or a monthly basis. Now, if these transfer payments are very high, remember that if these transfer payments are very high, that actually reduces the incentive to work. And this is a evaluation of transfer payments, that you must know that if the transfer payments in any economy are very high, then yes, welfare payments do help improve society's welfare because they help the poor or the needy. But then it also results into reduction in incentive to work. And they're like, okay, fine, the government is feeding our stomach. Why the heck do we care about doing a 9 to 5 job where we can just, although that money won't be enough, but then at least your basic necessities are being fulfilled. So what's the point? If you're doing a 9 to 5 job, earning only maybe $10 a month, but then you're also getting $10 in government's welfare benefits, then just sit at home and enjoy and take it from the government. Why work? So basically what I'm saying is it reduces incentive to work. And if your incentive to work goes down, that basically creates voluntary unemployment. Now, voluntary unemployment is a situation where the people are unemployed because of their own will, and not because of economic factors, but just because of the fact that they just got unemployed themselves. They want to be unemployed. That's called voluntary unemployment. That's called voluntary unemployment. And that is mainly due to when the incentive to work goes down. So basically the narrative that we're trying to establish over here is that if the wages in the economy goes up, right, if you're getting more wages in the economy, and if these wages exceed the transfer payments, if the wages exceed the transfer payments, right? So basically, what would happen is that this would reduce voluntary unemployment. So less people will now be voluntarily unemployed, and even those people who were voluntarily unemployed before, if they were voluntarily unemployed, they were sitting at home and enjoying food that was provided by the government in the form of money. But then now they'll be like, okay, fine, we're earning more money doing a job than just getting transfer payments. So they might get back to the labor force and they might start working. So employment levels would go up. So the narrative that, the question is saying that the discuss whether or not a country with high wage rates will have high unemployment does not always hold true because of the following reasons. In fact, at times high wage rates may result into low unemployment, right? At times high wage rates may result into low unemployment rates because of the reasons that we just mentioned. And you could conclude your answer by saying that it's not always true that higher wage rates may result into high unemployment. It depends upon a lot of factors that need to be considered into account. But yes, high wage rates may result into high unemployment for so and so reasons, but then this narrative does not hold true for so and so reasons that we mentioned above, right? So this kind of conclusion would be enough for a question like this. So that's it, guys, for this video. I hope you all enjoyed the